I'm Jay Elias, General Legal Counsel at Dyer-Lake Funeral Home in North Attleboro. Welcome to this episode of Live and Learn, a series of programs designed to be informative, educational, and upbeat, and always intended to enhance and encourage our personal wellness and awareness. This episode begins with a quick primer on the Earth, the Moon, the tilt of the Earth's axis, the seasons, the months, and the calendar. Phew. For most of us, sunrise, sunset, and the cycle of day into night and night into day are simple facts of life. And as we learned in our early education, the Earth rotates once in about 24 hours with respect to the sun. And because the Earth's axial tilt, day and night aren't evenly divided, we experience the variability of the seasons and the months which comprise those seasons, in large part based on the tilt of the axis. Looking back to ancient Greek and Roman times, their calendars were based on 10 months and only about 304 days. The remaining 61 days, they were for the most part simply disregarded and thought to have occurred during what was called the winter season. Ancient astronomers had limited knowledge of the solar year, and so periodic adjustments were made to bring the calendar in line with the appropriate season. And March was considered the beginning of the year, and every other year a month was inserted after February, and that added an additional 23 or 24 days to that year. A solar year, that is the time it takes Earth to orbit the sun, lasts around 365 and a quarter days, while a lunar year, or 12 full cycles of the moon, is roughly 354 days. Because of that discrepancy, a purely lunar calendar, like some religious ones, don't stay aligned with the seasons. Islam's holy month of Ramadan, for example, may fall in summer one year and winter a number of years later. To correct for this seasonal drift, other cultures rely on what's called a lunisolar calendar. For those calendars, a month is still defined by the moon, but an extra month is added periodically to stay close to the solar year. And a purely solar calendar, like the Gregorian calendar we use, tells us nothing about the phases of the moon. The Gregorian calendar is the most widely used civil calendar in the world today. It's the calendar used in the International Standard for Representation of Dates and Times. So that's a very little bit of the science. Let's take a look at some events that have occurred over the years during the 12 months of our modern Gregorian calendar year. Beginning with January 1. January 1, 1892, to be precise. That day saw Ellis Island in New York Harbor accept its first new arrivals in America when the steamship Nevada arrived with 124 passengers from Europe. The first would-be immigrant to set foot on the island was Annie Moore, a teenager from County Cork, Ireland, who had crossed the Atlantic with her 11 and 7-year-old brothers en route to reuniting with family in New York. A U.S. Treasury Department official and a Catholic chaplain were actually on hand to welcome Moore, and Ellis Island's commissioner awarded her a $10 gold piece to mark the occasion. Today, a statue of Moore and her brothers is kept on display at the Ellis Island Immigration Museum. But from 1900 until 1914, considered to be the peak years of Ellis Island's operations, an average of 1,900 people passed through the immigration station every day. Most successfully passed through in a matter of hours, but others could be detained for days or weeks. On average, the inspection process took anywhere from 3 to 7 hours. Over 20 million new arrivals to America were processed at Ellis Island until its closing in 1954. It's been estimated that just about 40% of all present-day U.S. citizens can actually trace at least one of their ancestors to Ellis Island. January 3, 1959. That day saw Alaska admitted as our country's 49th state. With a landmass of more than 600,000 square miles, it's almost 1/5 the size of the lower 48 states put together. And on January 23, 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell was awarded her medical degree by the Medical Institute of Geneva, New York, becoming our country's first woman physician. She later established a hospital in New York City that was operated by an all-female staff. And Blackwell was active in training women to be nurses and healthcare providers during the American Civil War. And that takes us to February. Cards, flowers, cute stuffed animals, chocolates, candy of all kinds, maybe a nice dinner. Across the U.S. as well as other places in the world, February 14 is celebrated as Valentine's Day, named in honor of Saint Valentine. Although its origins are far from certain, one thing is known. Valentine's Day doesn't appear to have its roots in anything quite as sweet or romantic as we'd like to think from reading all those lovey-dovey Valentine cards or heart-shaped candies. There are a number of versions as to the origins of the day. Many find their starting point in the Catholic Church. One well-known legend has it that Valentine was a priest serving during the 3rd century in Rome, at a time when Roman Emperor Claudius II determined that single men made better soldiers than those with wives. And so Claudius decreed that marriage for all young men was to be outlawed. After all, he needed those men to be focused on their country's defense and his defense and well-being, not on their loved ones at home. On the other hand, Valentine, a priest, believed the decree was patently unjust, and so he defied the emperor's decree, continuing to perform marriages in secret. Once his defiance was discovered, though, Valentine was beaten and beheaded. It's said to have occurred on February 14, and his martyrdom may well be the reason why we have come to celebrate Valentine's Day. By the way, it's been reported in a published study by the National Retail Federation that we collectively spend about $26 billion during the period leading up to Valentine's Day. March. On March 1, 1961, President John F. Kennedy established the Peace Corps. Since that time, more than 240,000 Americans have volunteered their time and efforts serving in more than 140 nations. You may know that the mission of the Peace Corps is to promote world peace and friendship by fulfilling 3 goals: to help the people of interested countries in meeting their need for trained men and women, to help promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of the peoples served, and to help promote a better understanding of other peoples on the part of Americans. Although it's known that over the years, certain organizations were created as fronts for the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the Peace Corps has never been identified as one of them, even though there have been rumors to the contrary. And because Peace Corps volunteers are often ingrained in the culture of the countries they're helping, it isn't uncommon for them to be privy to information that might be considered useful to the U.S. government. So to help reduce even the suggestion that Peace Corps volunteers are working in any clandestine manner, the Peace Corps application itself provides that previous employment by the CIA automatically excludes all applicants from ever serving as Peace Corps volunteers. And it was on March 4, 1933, during his first inaugural address, that FDR, seeking to restore public confidence during the Great Depression, spoke the words many of us still know today. And I quote, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And that brings us to the month of April. It was on April 6, 1896, that the so-called modern Olympic Games, a long-lost tradition of ancient Greece, were reborn in Athens after having been banned 1,500 years earlier by Roman Emperor Theodosius I. The ancient Olympics were held every 4 years and first occurred during a religious festival honoring the Greek god Zeus. Initially, Olympic competition was limited to foot races, but later a number of other events were added: wrestling, boxing, horse and chariot racing, military competitions, and then the pentathlon. It seems, though, that the games were doomed when Greece succumbed to Rome in the 2nd century AD. When the Roman Emperor and the empire formally embraced Christianity, the Olympic Games were first discouraged and then outlawed as a kind of pagan religious practice. And it was thought that since the Olympic Games were first and foremost a religious celebration in honor of Zeus, they could hold no place in the Roman Christian Empire. And so they were legally abolished in about 393 AD. April 9, 1865. That was the day when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, the head of the Union Army, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. But the Civil War itself did not officially end until 16 months later, when President Andrew Johnson declared a formal end to the war. But let's go back. It was 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, that President Abraham Lincoln was shot and mortally wounded by an actor, John Wilkes Booth, as we know, while Lincoln was watching a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. He passed away the following morning. But you may not have known the reason why Booth shot President Lincoln. It seems that after meeting with Confederate spies in the summer of 1864, Booth, a longtime Confederate sympathizer, spearheaded a plot to kidnap President Lincoln and bring him to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. The idea was to use Lincoln as a bargaining chip to secure the release of Confederate prisoners. So in March 1865, Booth and his fellow conspirators hid along a country road in Washington, D.C., intending to commandeer the presidential carriage that was scheduled to carry Lincoln to a performance of a play at Campbell Hospital to benefit wounded soldiers. But the president had a change of plans, and the carriage didn't travel that country road on the day. After the fall of Richmond and General Lee's surrender, a frustrated and angry Booth chose to assassinate rather than kidnap Lincoln, with the help from some of his remaining co-conspirators. And it was on that same day, April 15, but in 1912, in the icy waters of Newfoundland, that the luxury liner Titanic, with more than 2,000 people on board, sank after striking an iceberg. Over 1,500 persons drowned, while 700 were rescued by the liner Carpathia, which arrived about 2 hours after the Titanic went down. And that brings us to May 5 to be precise. And for many, they know that date as Cinco de Mayo. It's actually more than an excuse to drink tequila or margaritas, but the vast majority of Americans who crowd into bars and restaurants, Mexican restaurants, every May 5th have no idea what they're celebrating. They're just happy to celebrate something. In fact, though, Cinco de Mayo is a Mexican national holiday in remembrance of the Battle of Puebla, which took place on May 5, 1862, when Mexican troops, who had been vastly outnumbered, unexpectedly defeated the invading French forces of Napoleon III. The conflict between the two countries had begun after the President of Mexico suspended that country's foreign debt payments to France. Napoleon III responded by sending French troops to invade. For those in our country who do associate the day with Mexican history, most wrongly mistake it for Mexico's Independence Day, but that's celebrated on September 16. And speaking of drinks, not tequila or margaritas, instead think mint juleps and women with fanciful and colorful hats and a crowd singing "My Old Kentucky Home." It's all part of the Kentucky Derby, the longest running sporting event in the United States. It was on May 17, 1875, that the first Kentucky Derby was held. Often referred to as the Run for the Roses because the winning horse is adorned with a garland made up of hundreds of red roses. The race, which only lasts about 2 minutes, is enjoyed by millions of people around the world. Competing horses are 3 years of age, and those mint juleps, well, last year alone, more than 120,000 of them were served at the racetrack. But the Kentucky Derby's history dates back a few years earlier to 1872, when Meriwether Lewis Clark, the grandson of William Clark of the famed explorers Lewis and Clark, traveled to Europe and attended a derby in England. He was inspired by his travels and experiences, and he decided when he returned to the state that he wanted to create a similar horse racing event. So with the help of his uncles, John and Henry Churchill, who gave Clark the land he needed to develop a racetrack, Clark organized a group of local race fans who became the Louisville Jockey Club. And so it was that Churchill Downs and the Kentucky Derby came to life in Louisville, Kentucky. And also in May 20, 1932, Amelia Earhart became the first woman and only the second person to fly solo across the Atlantic when she departed Newfoundland, Canada, and landed near Londonderry, Ireland, completing a more than 2,000-mile flight in about 13 hours. She tragically went missing with her navigator 5 years later while attempting to fly around the world at the equator in her twin-engine plane. But what you may not have known about Amelia Earhart was the fact that she was the first woman vice president of the National Aeronautic Association. And she was well ahead of her times as a business entrepreneur, having, among other things, designed and manufactured a line of functional women's clothing. She even modeled her own designs for promotional features. Earhart was also a visiting professor at Purdue University and a vocal advocate of higher education for women, especially in the fields of engineering and science. And that brings us to June. On June 14, 1777, John Adams introduced a resolution before Congress mandating a United States flag, stating that the flag of the 13 United States shall be 13 stripes alternating red and white, and that the Union be 13 stars, white on a blue field, representing a new constellation. The anniversary of that date is celebrated every year as Flag Day. And also in June 14, 1951, UNIVAC 1, the world's first commercial electronic computer, was unveiled in Philadelphia. It was installed at the Census Bureau there. The Universal Automatic Computer, UNIVAC, was described by the New York Times at the time as an 8-foot-tall mathematical genius that filled an entire room. It was said to be able to compute a complicated payroll for 10,000 employees in only 40 minutes, something that today would take a fraction of a second to calculate. And did you know that on July 5, 1775, the Continental Congress adopted what came to be known as the Olive Branch Petition, expressing hope for reconciliation with Great Britain? Bet you didn't know that one. King George III refused to even look at the petition and instead issued a proclamation declaring the colonists to be in a state of open rebellion. On July 4, 1776, contrary to what most Americans believe happened on that date, the Declaration of Independence was approved by the Continental Congress. The formal copy of the Declaration was not officially finalized until 2 weeks later, and it wasn't actually signed until August 2nd, 1776. And one of the most famous paintings by John Trumbull of Jefferson, Hancock, Adams, Franklin, and Roger Sherman, which is often associated with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, actually depicts those gentlemen presenting the draft of the document on June 28, 1776, not signing it. Brings us to August. And if you were there and remember it, then kudos to you. It was on August 15, 1969, that Woodstock began in a field near Yasgur's farm at Bethel, New York, about an hour's drive from Woodstock. The 3-day concert featured 24 rock bands and drew a crowd of between 400 and 500,000 people. It's been reported that Woodstock cost an estimated $3 million to fund, but brought in only about $1.8 million, taking those festival organizers years to pay off their debts. September. Let's just take a moment to remember all who perished and all whose lives were forever changed on September 11, 2001. On August 6, 1927, the opening performance of the first talkie movie in New York took place. The Jazz Singer featured Al Jolson and was touted as the first full-length feature film using spoken dialogue. Although other films had synchronized sound for music or sound effects before The Jazz Singer, it was the first full feature film to have a soundtrack that included dialogue using something called Vitaphone. But contrary to what many have thought, the movie was neither a critical nor a financial success. The primary problem was that when the film was released, there were less than 100 theaters in the world properly equipped to show it and to play the sound. The vast majority of movie theaters simply didn't have the right equipment, and so audiences were left watching a movie without subtitles and unable to follow the storyline. And film critics, well, they called it simply uninteresting. It was in 1939 that President Franklin Roosevelt hoped that a lengthened holiday shopping season would increase spending and alleviate some of the effects of the Great Depression. So in 1941, he signed a bill making the fourth Thursday in November the official date for Thanksgiving nationwide, regardless of whether it's the last Thursday of the month or not. And so it was that on November 27, 1924, Macy's held its first parade. But instead of focusing on Thanksgiving, it was actually called Macy's Christmas Parade. The parade was held just by store employees, and the hope was that the celebration would influence customers to shop for the coming Christmas season. It featured live animals from the Central Park Zoo. There were none of the balloons the parade is known for today, but there were floats, puppets, celebrities, bands, Macy's employees in costumes, and Santa Claus. The first balloon wasn't used until 1927 when Felix the Cat made its debut. The parade didn't reach national TV screens until 1947, and at times during World War II, Macy's canceled the event because there wasn't enough rubber or helium to create and inflate those balloons. When the parade resumed, the balloons were often deflated and donated to help World War II rubber supplies. And that brings us to the month of December. And rather than focus on one of the more well-known and most loved days of the month, let's consider instead December 5th. Actually, December 5th, 1933 in particular. That was the day the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, often known as the Prohibition Amendment, was repealed. The 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919, and America went dry at midnight on January 17, 1920. So for nearly 14 years, the 18th Amendment outlawed the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States. But it didn't outlaw the possession or consumption of alcohol. And there were enough loopholes and quirks to open the door to a slew of avoidance schemes. One of the most well-known loopholes enabled pharmacists to dispense alcohol, particularly whiskey, by prescription for a host of ailments, from anxiety to the flu. And as a result, bootlickers soon realized that operating a pharmacy was a perfect front for the sale of alcohol. And so it was that in New York State alone, the number of registered pharmacists actually tripled during the Prohibition era. I'm Jay Elias. Thank you for watching this episode of Live and Learn. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to your joining me again for another program designed to enhance and encourage your personal wellness and awareness. Until then, remember, it's never too late to learn. And in closing, consider this thought from the French author and philosopher Albert Camus. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that there was in me an invincible summer.